쑥스러운 소개를 해주세요. 굉장히 많이 와주셔서 감사드리고요. 예, 오늘 피터 틸 강연의 진행을 맡게 된 임정훈입니다. 반갑습니다. 예, 일단 피터 틸이 입장하기 전에 간단하게 피터 틸을 소개하는 이 소개를 잠깐 드리도록 하겠습니다. 예, 피터 틸은 67년생으로 현재 47세고요. 실리콘밸리에서 가장 주목받는 창업자이자 벤처 투자자입니다. 이분은 한 살 때 독일에서 미국으로 실리콘밸리로 이민을 왔고요. 그런 다음에 스탠포드 대학에서 철학을 전공하고 로스쿨에서 법학을 전공했습니다. 그 다음에 로펌과 금융기관에서 잠시 일한 뒤에 98년도에 그는 맥스 레비친과 함께 페이팔을 창업을 합니다. 그런 다음에 일론 머스크의 엑스닷컴과 합병하면서 페이팔을 성장시킵니다. 이때 유명한 페이팔 마피아가 형성됐고요. 초기 페이팔 출신들은 이후 유튜브, 테슬라, 에어비앤비, 링크드인 같은 조단위 가치 스타트업들을 많이 만들어내게 됩니다. 그리고 나서 그는 2002년 초에 페이팔을 시장에 증시에 상장시킨 다음에 그해 말에 이베이의 페이팔을 15억 불에 매각을 했습니다. 이후에 그는 크라리움 캐피탈이라는 헤지펀드 회사를 세우고 투자자로서 활발히 활동하기 시작합니다. 2004년에는 빅데이터 분석 서비스를 제공하는 팔란티어 테크놀로지를 공동 창업합니다. CIA의 대테러 정보를 제공한다고 해서 유명해진 이 회사는 비상장 기업으로 현재 또 15조 원의 가치를 지닌 그런 회사로 알려져 있습니다. 하지만 무엇보다 피터 틸이 유명해진 것은 2004년도에 페이스북의 첫 번째 외부 투자자로서 50만 불을 투자하고 그리고 지분 10%를 받았습니다. 10년이 조금 넘은 지금 그의 투자는 그에게 1조 5천억 정도의 이 이익을 실현해 줬고요. 그는 아직도 페이스북의 사회이사로 일하고 있습니다. 그는 2005년부터는 파운더스 펀드를 설립하고 엔젤 투자자로서 벤처 캐피탈로서 활발히 투자하고 있습니다. 그는 파운더스 펀드를 통해서 스페이스X, 에어비앤비, 스포티파이, 스트라이프, 리프트, 오큘러스 같은 유명한 실리콘밸리 회사들에 지금 투자를 하고 있고요. 또 하나 특이한 것은 그 자신 명문대 출신이면서도 대학에 다닐 시간에 창업을 하는 것이 낫다고 설파를 해서 매년 대학을 중퇴하고 창업에 뛰어든 20세 이하의 20명의 젊은이들에게 10만 불의 장학금을 주는 틸 펠로우십을 만들어서 논란을 일으키고 있기도 합니다. 또 그는 샌프란시스코 인근 해상에 인공섬을 만들어서 규제가 없는 자유로운 국가를 만든다는 그런 실험적인 프로젝트에 투자하기도 했습니다. 지난해 그는 스탠포드대에서 가졌던 창업 강좌의 내용을 묶어서 제로 투 원이라는 책을 출판했습니다. 그만의 독특한 세계관과 창업 생태계에 대한 해석을 담은 이 책은 전 세계에서 열광적인 반응을 얻으면서 베스트셀러로 올랐습니다. 그는 현재 창업 정신을 설파하기 위해서 정열적으로 세계 각국을 다니면서 강연을 하고 있고요. 이번 강연을 위해서 이 대만, 일본을 거쳐서 지금 한국에 왔고 이 강연이 끝나면은 바로 베이징으로 출국한다고 합니다. 예, 피터 틸을 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a tremendous honor to be here in Korea today. Can people hear me? Good. I want to maybe just have some brief comments in the opening, and then leave as much time as possible for questions and answers, so we can make it as interactive a discussion as possible. The book 0 to 1 came out of a class that I taught at Stanford University in 2012, where I try to summarize everything that I've learned about startups, businesses, founding companies in technology in particular over the years, and then try to distill all of this into the 0 to 1 book. And one of the great challenges in teaching entrepreneurship, in writing about entrepreneurship, is that there is no formula. There's no. It's not like there are 7 steps you can follow and you'll have a successful company. And people are always looking for a formula. There's no formula. There's no science. Science starts with a number 2. Science starts with experiments you can repeat, things you can do repeatedly. But every moment in the history of business happens once and only once. And so the next Mark Zuckerberg will not be starting a social networking site. The next Larry Page will not start a search engine. The next Bill Gates will not start an operating system. If you are copying these people, you will not be able to learn from them. And so one of the challenges then is, what can you say at all? Or how does one even start if the most critical thing is singular, new, strange, different every single time? And I try to get at it through sort of a series of indirect questions. You know, what great business is nobody starting? Or the intellectual question that I think is always a terrific interview question to ask people is, tell me something that is true that very few people agree with you on. And this is a shockingly hard question for people to answer. It's hard because we think you have to be brilliant to come up with some new truth. But it's also hard because in the context of an interview, it's always very uncomfortable because the good answers are the unpopular answers. And so if you tell the interviewer something like the education system is broken or our political system's kind of screwed up, these are answers everybody already believes to be true. They're already understood. These are bad answers. The good answers are ones that people will not want to hear. And I think we live in a world in which courage is in much shorter supply than genius. So what I want to do today is offer a few of my answers to this question, things that I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on, and maybe use that as a starting point for the conversation. And let me start with this idea of the singularity of great businesses, that all great companies do something unique and very different. And I think that people often think that capitalism and competition are somehow the same thing, that they're synonyms. I think they're antonyms. I think a capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital, whereas a world of perfect competition is a world where all the profits are competed away. And so a great company is a company that does not compete at all. It is a monopoly. And we can have a debate if monopolies are good or bad from the point of view of society, but from the point of view of a founder, of an investor, of an early employee, you always want to be inside a monopoly. You want to be inside a company that is doing something so different, so much better than anybody else, that for all practical purposes, there's no competition at all. If you want to compete like crazy, the example of a business I always think you should start is you should start a restaurant. It is a terrible idea. Most restaurants go out of business. Even if you do not go out of business, you will barely make any money. But you will get ferocious competition day and night, every single day, nothing but competition and zero in profits. And sort of at the opposite end of the restaurant business, the example I give in my book of a great monopoly company is a company like Google, which US, Western Europe, much of the world, has a fantastic monopoly on search. And this is why it has been so profitable for the last 13 years and why it has made so much money. And so I think this is the single business idea that I always think people don't understand at all, that the fundamental distinction in business between monopoly companies and competitive companies, and this is the most important difference in business to try to think through and to try to get on the monopoly side. If you, it's not understood for a few different reasons. One reason this monopoly idea is not understood is somewhat intellectual, or if you are a company that has a monopoly, you will generally never talk about it because you will be worried that if you're the CEO of Google, you will not go around saying, we have a fantastic monopoly, our profit margins are even higher than Microsoft's were in the 90s. If you will go around saying that, the government will come after you very, very quickly. And so the people who have monopolies, as a general rule, do not talk about it. And as a result, it's very, very obscured as a theme. And what you do instead if you have a monopoly in search like Google has, you try to say that you're in a market that's much bigger. And you say that you're not a search company. You describe yourself as a technology company, which is this much, much bigger space where you're competing with Apple, with the Android versus the iPhone. And you're competing with all these other companies in different ways. And you're building self-driving cars. So you're going to be competing with all the car companies. And so you redefine your market as this much bigger market where there seems to be competition everywhere so that the government will not come after you. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you were to open, if you were to start something super competitive, so if you were to leave my talk today and say, I'm going to really open that restaurant after all, you quickly run into problems. People wouldn't want to give you money. They'd say it's a bad idea. These things never quite work. And you'd end up, and then you try to say, well, it's not just going to be a Korean restaurant, it's going to be a British, Nepalese fusion cuisine. It'll be the only one in Seoul. And so you will redefine your market as a fictionally small market. And so again, you will obscure the true nature of how much competition you're up against. And so because I think of these distorted stories that people tell about the businesses they're in, the fundamental dichotomy of monopoly versus competition is obscured in very important ways. But I think there's a second reason that's a little bit deeper why this monopoly idea makes people so uncomfortable. And it's a little bit more psychological in nature. I think that there's the opening sentence of Anna Karenina, the Russian novel, is all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think all happy companies are different because they found something unique to do. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the chapter in my book, All Happy Companies Are Different, was reprinted in the Wall Street Journal, they got to retitle it, and they shifted the title from All Happy Companies Are Different to something a little bit punchier, a little bit more edge. They shifted it to Competition is for Losers, which is very counterintuitive, because we think the losers are the people who are not good enough at competing. We think of the losers as the people who get bad grades or bad test scores, or the losers are the people who are slow on the sports team. We don't think of the losers as the people who are somehow too addicted to competition, too obsessed with the people around them, and that they've somehow lost perspective on reality. And the personal version of this is that I grew up in California, and it was sort of a very tracked environment where everything was sort of competition for grades and schools and test scores. Already my 8th grade yearbook in junior high school, one of my friends wrote in, I know you're going to go to get into Stanford University in 4 years. 4 years later, I got into Stanford. I went to Stanford. There's another tournament. Then I got into law school, which is a graduate school in the U.S. And then you sort of ended up at a top law firm in New York in my mid-20s. And so it was you had sort of all these competitions, and you were doing them not because you were interested in the subject matter or for any substantive reason. You were doing them because of status, prestige, things of that sort. And the law firm I ended up, it was a very strange place, because on the outside it was a place where everybody wanted to get in. On the inside it was a place where everybody wanted to get out. After I left after 7 months and 3 days, and one of the people down the hall from me said it was really reassuring to see me leave. He had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz, the prison in California. So he thought of the company as this crazy maximum security prison. And of course, all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But psychologically, this was very hard for people to do, because their whole sense of identity, their sense of self-worth was all wrapped up in the competitions they had won over time that had gotten them to this place. And so I think we always get caught up in these competitive dynamics. Henry Kissinger, once describing his fellow faculty at Harvard University, said, "The battles in academia are so fierce because the stakes are so small." And so on one level, you'd think this describes a group of people who are just completely insane. Why would you fight like crazy over things where the stakes are really, really small? But it also describes the logic of a situation. If the competition is very intense, if there are a lot of people who are willing to do something, then you don't have to pay people very much. If you don't want to be a professor at Harvard, we'll find someone else to be the professor. And as a result, once you're a professor at Harvard, you actually get paid surprisingly little. You know, when you win competitions that are very, very intense, you never have to get rewarded very much at the end, because there always are other people who are willing to do whatever you just did. This sort of competition monopoly idea, it has many different applications. I'll maybe just mention one or two. Certainly one application is that when you start a new company, you want to start in something that's, you want to start with small markets, because you want to get a large market share. You don't want to go after big markets. People always say you want to go after big markets. I think you want to start with small markets so you can quickly get to a large market share. PayPal, we started with, payments is a huge market. We started with 20,000 power sellers on eBay, a small subset of the payments market where there was a very big problem in 99, 2000. And we got from 0 to 35% market share in 3 or 4 months. So that was a very good start for the business. Facebook started among students at Harvard University. It started with 12,000 people. Such a small market that if you had written this up as a business plan, nobody would have invested. They would have said, it's too small a market, it's not interesting. But you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. Very promising start. And then you gradually scaled it from there. And then all the businesses that get pitched as going after really big markets, I have found to often be incredibly challenging. We had this clean tech disaster in the US in the last decade, where so many of these clean tech companies failed. And there were many different things that went wrong. But one systematic mistake was the markets were too big. And so the clean tech PowerPoint presentations that you saw, the first slide would always be something like, we have a market that's measured in hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. It's this vast market, it's called energy, and if we just have a small fraction of the market, we will have a very valuable company. But the problem is that when you're a small fish in a big ocean, there's just tremendous amounts of competition. And so, you know, if you're a thin film solar panel company, you then have to beat the other 9 thin film solar panel companies. Then you have to beat the next 90 solar panel companies. And then you had to beat the wind companies. And then you had the fracking industry that came out of nowhere in the US. And then you had the cheaper Chinese manufacturing that came out of nowhere. And it was just competition everywhere, profits nowhere in sight. One of the ideas I always get asked about at these events is, what are some trends I see in technology? Where do I see technology going? And this is always a very hard question to answer. I'm not a prophet. I can't predict the future. You're tempted to give very banal answers like, more people will be using cell phones in 5 years or something like that. But I think what I've become convinced of is that every trend that people talk about is overrated. If you've heard about a trend, chances are it's overrated. So in Silicon Valley, there's a big trend around, a lot of people talk about educational software, healthcare IT software. Suspect it's very overrated. SaaS, software as a service, enterprise software, very overrated. If you hear the words big data or cloud computing, you need to run away as fast as you possibly can. You need to think fraud and just run away. And the reason you need to be scared when you hear buzzwords is that the buzzwords, they're a tell, like in poker, they're an indication that you're bluffing, that you don't have a differentiated business, that your business is undifferentiated, because the buzzword means that you're in a category that people already understand. And when it's a category that's well understood, it means many other people are going to be in that category. And so when you hear these pitches where it's just a proliferation of buzzwords, I always get very nervous. So if you hear something like, we're building a mobile platform for SaaS in the cloud using big data, which is just a litany of buzzwords, that's telling you that the business is undifferentiated and that there are no ideas there at all. There's nothing unique or differentiated. And conversely, I think the things that are undervalued or underrated are all the things that are one of a kind, where it's often maybe we don't even have the words or the language to properly describe what a business is doing. And this is always a challenge for the people starting these companies. But those are the kinds of businesses that end up being very underrated and somehow not valued properly. And of course, one of the challenges as an investor is sometimes even the founders don't have quite the right words to describe their business, and they will describe their business in conventional terms, and this can be misleading. So when Google started in the late 90s, it would have been described as a search engine, and people would have said, why do we need another search engine? We already have so many of them. And I think that whole way of describing or thinking about the business missed everything that mattered. What mattered was the PageRank algorithm. What mattered was that you were going to have computers do search instead of humans. And that was what had changed. It wasn't a search engine, it was a computer-powered search engine, which was actually very, very different. Or if you take social networking with Facebook, Facebook was not the first social networking company. One of my friends, Reid Hoffman, who ended up starting LinkedIn, years earlier, in 1997, started a company called SocialNet. So they already had the name, so the social networking idea was already in the name of the company 7 years before Facebook. And they had all these crazy ideas about how you'd do the networking. You know, it would be in cyberspace, and you'd have these avatars, these alternate persona, and maybe one person would be a cat and one person would be a dog, and then you'd have to figure out ways the cats and dogs would interact with each other on the internet. And you know, it turned out none of this was really interesting. People didn't want to be cats or dogs. They wanted to be themselves. And what ultimately worked, what Facebook solved was not social networking or networking in the abstract. It was real identity. It was getting people to describe themselves as they really were on the internet. It was the first company to crack that. It's obviously, you know, there are all sorts of things around it that are very controversial. You have all these privacy questions, but you have the privacy question because it goes to something very deep and something very real. Real identity was a valuable problem, but it got obscured by putting it in this category of social networks. So we always have to think through these labels in one way or another. Let me hammer on this uniqueness idea in one last way. If you there's a strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where many of the successful founders and entrepreneurs in these companies seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's. They're somewhat socially not very well adapted in one way or another. And this always, I think we always need to turn this fact around into a critique of our society. And we need to ask, why are people who do not have Asperger's at a disadvantage? Because they end up being talked out of their original, interesting, creative ideas before they're even fully formed. Because you pick up all these social cues from the people around you and you sense, oh, that's a little bit too strange, that's too weird, this person's looking at me funny, I better not do this, I'm gonna just stick with opening that restaurant after all, just like everybody else. You know, if you think about the anti-Asperger's cohort, I think on some level it's business school students. You know, they're sort of people who get MBAs in the US. They're people who are socially super well adapted. They're very extroverted, probably very low conviction level, often have no real ideas of their own. And you sort of put all these people in a hothouse environment for 2 years in a business school, and they spend 2 years talking to other people just like themselves. They're very, you know, spend a lot of time socializing because they're social. And they don't, and they all, at the end of the 2 years, they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest number of people always go into the wrong field. They, you know, in 1989, it's like they all finally conclude that we need to catch the last wave. In '89, they all wanted to work for Michael Milken, the junk bond king, 1 or 2 years before he went to jail. They were never really interested in tech, except for 99, 2000, when they descended on Silicon Valley and in effect timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly, and on down the line. And so I think there is this, you know, the word ape, already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape in English meant both primate and to imitate. And there is something very deep in human nature around imitation. It's how we learn language as kids growing up from our parents. We imitate our parents. It's how culture is transmitted. But it also leads to all sorts of insane behaviors. It's what makes us ape-like, sheep-like, herd-like, lemming-like. It's what leads to the peer pressures, to the madness of crowds, to crazy market bubbles of one sort or another. And so it is something that one must always try to resist in all sorts of different forms. Let me end my comments with one somewhat bigger picture, contrarian thought that not that many people agree with me on. So I think that if we're going to have a successful 21st century, it will involve both globalization and technology. But I think of these two things as very different. These are words that, again, often get used interchangeably. But I always draw globalization on the x-axis. Globalization involves copying things that work, going from one to n, horizontal or extensive growth. And I always draw technology on the y-axis. Technology is going from 0 to 1, doing new things. It's vertical or intensive progress. And when we think about the history of the last few centuries, there have been eras of globalization and of technology, and they don't precisely overlap. The 19th century, you had both. You had a lot of globalization, a lot of technology. It sort of came to an end around the start of World War I, where trade broke down, parts of the world started to become communist, and the world became less and less connected. But technology kept progressing in the years after 1914. And so the 20th century started with this period of, where globalization went in reverse, but then you had a lot of technological progress. And then I would argue that maybe globalization restarted with a Kissinger trip to China in 1971. And the last 40 years have been 40 years of breakneck pace globalization, but somewhat more limited technological progress. And we've had a lot of progress in IT and information technology, semiconductors, computers, internet, mobile internet, but not so much outside of IT. And if you think about the word technology in the 1950s or 1960s had a much broader meaning. It would have meant rockets and spaceships and supersonic airplanes. It would have meant the green revolution in agriculture, new ways to increase food yields. It would have meant underwater cities, new forms of energy, new medicines, new medical devices, all sorts of new materials. And so there's been this sort of, we had the 20th century had a period of intense technology and no globalization, and now intense globalization and limited technology, mostly focused on the world of bits, not on the world of atoms. And I think the ways in which, I think, in the US, Western Europe, our societies are deeply hostile at this point to all things having to do with science and technology. And people always disagree with me on this. They say, oh, that's crazy. We're all in favor of technology. But I think there's actually a lot of hostility to it in all these different forms. And the easiest way to see that our culture is fundamentally oriented against science and technology is just to look at all the science fiction films that come out of Hollywood. And they basically show uniformly, they show technology that does not work, that kills people, that's going to destroy the world, that's dystopian in one way or another. And so the future is some combination of these bad science fiction films. It's like The Matrix or Avatar or Elysium, the Terminator film with robots running around shooting everybody. I watched the Gravity film the other day, where you were up in a space station, and after watching that film, you would never want to go into outer space. You would be so happy to be back on a muddy island with some palm trees somewhere. And it's, I'm not blaming Hollywood for this, because I think Hollywood just reflects the broader culture, which is a culture that does not like technology. And this is why I think those of us who are working on these things are extremely countercultural in our society. This is very much against the current to be in favor of progress, in favor of doing some very new things. Or we can describe this not in cultural terms, but in geopolitical terms. in the 1950s and 1960s, you would have divided the world into the first world and the third world. The first world was that part that was technologically accelerating. The third world was that part that was permanently screwed up. So it was a pro-tech but no globalization dichotomy. Today we would talk about the developing and developed countries. And this way of describing the world is a pro-globalization dichotomy. The developing countries are those countries that are copying the developed world. They are converging with the developed world. And so it's a way of describing the world where it's becoming more homogeneous, more alike, more and more the same over time. And globalization continues apace. But it is also implicitly a way of describing our world that is anti-technological. Because when we say that we live in the developed world, whether it's in Western Europe or the US or in South Korea, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world where most of the development happened in the past, where nothing new is going to happen, where things are done, finished, and we should expect not much to change in the years and decades ahead, and where the younger generation should have reduced expectations for the future relative to their parents and grandparents. And I think this is a conception of our world that we should try to resist very strenuously. And we should try to break out of it in any way we possibly can. And so I will end with a contrarian question that I think needs to be asked far more often. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.
잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. 예. 오늘 강연에 이 참석하신 분들 중에서 스타트업에서 오신 분들이 얼마나 많은지 저희가 한번 궁금해서 가볍게 모바일로 스타트업이 만든 모바일 IT&Basic이라는 한국 스타트업이 만든 모바일 앱이 있습니다. 그걸 통해서 모바일 설문조사를 해봤습니다. 내용을 한번 보여주시죠. 네, 어떤 일을 하고 계신가에 대해서 한 200명 가까이 대답을 해주셨는데요. 그 중에서 거의 절반 가까이가 스타트업에 일을 하시는 분들이고, 또 그 다음으로 많은 분들이 이 기업에서 일을 하시는 분입니다. 네, 그래서 한 절반 정도가 스타트업에서 와서 그만큼 많이 이 피터 틸 씨의 제로 투 원에 대해서 이렇게 관심이 많은 것 같습니다. 첫 번째로 질문드리는 것은 피터 틸 씨는 굉장히 많이 이렇게 요즘에 대중 강연을 하고 계십니다. 유튜브에서 이름을 검색해 보면은 굉장히 많은 이런 강연 결과가 나와서 이렇게 볼 수가 있는데, 사실 뭐 전혀 그렇게 하지 않아도 될 만한 위치에 있는데 이렇게 열심히 강연을 하고 이 제로 투 원의 내용에 대해서 이야기를 하시는 이유는 뭔가요?
So, well, when you write a book, it always takes quite a long time to write a book. So I think the minimum you have to then afterwards do is spend, a few months trying to shamelessly promote the book in all these different contexts. So maybe it's crazy to write a book because that's like so much more work than promoting it. But I think that I've been in Silicon Valley for 15 to 17 years, working on in this startup ecosystem, both as a founder, as an investor, and there are many things I've learned. And I think it's a great way to share this knowledge with people. It's a great way to have conversations with people. I like it when people agree with my book, but in some ways it's even better when people read it and have, well, it's very interesting, but this is where we disagree, and that's how you advance your thinking. A lot of ideas, I think, only get developed when they get put in writing. You can't fully develop ideas just by having them in your mind. You have to put them on paper, see them reflected back at you, and that's how one really sharpens these ideas. And so the book was sort of all these talks I'd given over the years, all these things I told people in different contexts. But when you actually synthesize it and put it in writing, it really sharpens one's thinking tremendously, and that's very valuable to do.
예, 확실히 그건 정말 공감합니다. 실제로 이 글로 써야지 생각이 이렇게 정리된다는 것 같고요. 거기에 정말 공감을 하고, 우선 제가 먼저 질문을 드린 다음에 청중 여러분들이 심플로우 앱을 통해서 해주신 질문에 대해서 또 이 질문을 받도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 질문은 일단 이번에 15년 만에 아시아에 방문을 하시고 일본하고 한국에 방문을 하셨다 그러고 15년 전에 투자를 했었던 뭐 한국 투자자도 이번에 만나시고 그렇게 되셨는데 어떤 계기로 이번에 그 한국하고 일본하고 대만하고 그 중국을 방문하시게 됐는지가 궁금하고요. 이번에 이렇게 일본하고 대만의 이런 스타트업 생태계를 보면서 어떤 느낌을 받으셨는지 궁금합니다.
Well, it's always a little bit hard to get a sense on this, but I think that I've not spent enough time in Asia. That's sort of my one high level conclusion. I have to come back here way more in the years ahead. We did not expect our book to do as well as it did. We've sold something like 25,000 copies in South Korea. We sold about 150,000 in the U.S. So it's done about as well in South Korea relative to the population as in the U.S. Japan was around 60,000. So again, about the same as in the U.S. If you adjust for the population. And so it was a bit of a surprise to me that there was this level of intensity of interest in all of these things, much more so. And so I think that if you look at all these places, there is at this point, perhaps as intense an interest in startups as there is in the United States. There's much less of this in Europe generally. So the first thing is, much less in Europe, a lot in the U.S., a lot in East Asia. And I think there are certainly some differences between Taiwan and Japan and Korea. I think Korea feels like the highest energy, the most intense, maybe the craziest of the three places. But and Japan, one always still has the sense that starting a business is a little bit is something people just do not do. But I don't want to exaggerate the differences between these places, and I want to underscore that it's been surprising to me how intense the interest is in all of these places. I think it's as great as it is in the U.S. And much greater than Western Europe by contrast.
제가 또한 그렇게 한국에서 많이 팔릴 줄 몰랐습니다. 오늘 이렇게 많이 오신 것도 사실 이해가 되네요. 그만큼 한국에서 창업에 대해서 이렇게 관심이 많다는 얘기가 될 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 다음 질문은 요즘 전 세계적으로 핀테크가 화제입니다. 한국에서도 굉장히 요즘에 핀테크 이야기가 많이 나오고 있는데요. 피터 틸은 핀테크의 원조 회사라고 할 수 있는 페이팔을 거의 17년 전에 창업을 해서 성공시켰습니다. 그리고 요즘에도 흥미로운 핀테크 회사에 많이 투자를 하고 계세요. 스트라이프라든지 영국의 트랜스퍼와이즈 같은 곳에 이렇게 투자를 하고 계신데요. 핀테크 스타트업에 투자할 때의 기준은 무엇입니까? 어떤 회사에 그렇게 투자를 하시는지, 그리고 특히 트랜스퍼와이즈에 어떻게 해서 이렇게 투자를 결심을 하게 됐는지, 그리고 핀테크가 과연 진짜 이 중요한 트렌드고 앞으로 금융업계를 변화시킬 것이라고 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Let's see. Many different questions embedded in that one. So let me start with a cautionary note. So as I said in my talk, I'm always nervous about buzzwords, and so it's precisely to the extent fintech has become a buzzword, I've become correspondingly more nervous about it, because these categories always obscure far more than they illuminate, because it sort of paints too broad a brushstroke, and what matters is the particular and the specific, never the category as a whole. What's interesting about fintech as a category, I suppose, would be, if you wanted to talk about it as a category briefly, would be there is something very natural about finance and the internet and computers. They're all sort of virtual products. They involve mostly bits, zeros and ones, not atoms. And so there is a natural resonance between finance and IT or internet. And so it seems like a very natural thing to look at. There are many ways that one thinks it could be improved. So it seems like it's an area where there could be a lot of innovation. Probably the big general negative is that it's generally a very heavily regulated sector, especially on the banking side. And generally speaking, when you have things that are very heavily regulated, it's very hard for small companies to get started. Regulation is generally favor big companies over small companies. Now within, so those are sort of some of the pluses and minuses, but I think what matters always much more is the particular and the specific. And so the things I'm always very attracted to are these questions. Is there some monopoly that people have? Does a company have something that it's doing that can't easily be copied or replicated? And you can have monopolies on the level of, you have network effects, you can have economies of scale. Certainly if you have proprietary technology, that's always very interesting. I think there's often surprisingly little of that in fintech. So a very embarrassing question you can ask to people who say they're involved in fintech is to ask, where's the tech? If it's just a marketing device on the internet or something like that, that's like very thin technologically and often not that good. And then sometimes you have an advantage that comes from having new distribution channels where you have this idea, you have a good way of distributing it that nobody else has, and that can also be a source of a monopoly. So in the case of Stripe, which is sort of a new payment processing solution, I would say the critical advantage that Stripe did was it targeted the entire developer ecosystem. So it targeted the people who develop websites and convinced all of them to adopt its technology. And so traditionally you might have gone to the CTO of a company or the CIO of a company to get them to adopt your technology. In many cases, you now want to get the engineers or the web developers who are working on a website to think that Stripe is the solution you should embed. And they did a fantastic job of getting the entire developer community behind them. And so they have sort of a monopoly on the attention of the developer community. And that's why so many of the new companies that are emerging that are using a payment solution have gone with Stripe. And so you can often have a monopoly on the distribution channel, and that can be very powerful. And then I think many of the other ones, it comes down to sort of, is it a good idea? And are you able to execute quickly enough? So if it's something where it's a very, very big market, you say I had a fintech company, we're going to just start a new bank from scratch. That's a super big idea, but it will take too long. And so even if you succeed, other people will be able to copy you and replicate whatever you're doing. And so we often like ones that are a little bit more targeted, a little bit narrower. TransferWise started with remittance payments for people who already have bank accounts, so upper middle class people, starting with London to other cities in Western Europe. And so it was a sort of small target demographic. You could relatively quickly lock it up, and so that was sort of very promising. I think often you don't want to go after big companies. You want to go after markets people are not looking at. This is sort of a general rule that one of the other buzzwords that I do not like that gets used a lot is disruption. And so if you think that what you're supposed to do as a company is be disruptive, I think that's a bad attitude to have. The disruptive people look for attention and find it, but it's normally bad attention. The disruptive person in elementary school gets sent to the principal's office. A disruptive company, a classic example would be Napster, the music company, which set out to destroy the music industry. It actually more or less succeeded. It really hurt the music industry tremendously. But it had a disruptive name, Napster. In English, you nap some music, you nap a child, you're a kidnapper. So when you have a name like that, it screams disruption. A kidnapper is a disruptive person. And they got the attention of the government and were shut down very quickly. And so I think that if you're a fintech company or any other startup, your goal should not be to destroy a big bank or a big company. Your goal should be to create a new company. Maybe something happens in the process, but it's never destruction. It's always creation over destruction.
네, 저도 그 부분은 동감합니다. 핀테크는 굉장히 틈새 시장을 이렇게 공략하는 그런 그 스타트업들이 만들어야 될 것 같고요. 또 그 다음 질문은 그런 의미에서 한국은 핀테크가 굉장히 지금 뭐 불모지입니다. 한국이 인터넷 강국이라고 하지만 핀테크 스타트업은 이제 막 시작하는 단계고요. 여기에는 정부의 지나치게 엄격한 규제하고 스타트업과의 협력에 소극적인 금융기관들의 문제가 있습니다. 그리고 한국의 규제 시스템은 새로운 것을 시작하려면 항상 먼저 허가를 받아야 되는 그런 그 포지티브 레귤레이션이 문제라는 말이 많습니다. 예를 들어서 삼성이 지난주에 미국에서 루프페이를 인수를 했습니다. 루프페이를 인수를 했는데 루프페이가 만약에 한국에서 시작을 했더라면 이 허가를 받을 수 없어서 아예 제품을 출시할 수가 없었을 겁니다. 당신이 투자한 트랜스퍼 와이즈도 한국에서는 외환관리법 때문에 불법입니다. 예, 그래서 한국에서는 아직 페이팔도 안 되고 스트라이프도 되지 않는데 어떻게 생각하십니까? 이 핀테크 분야에서 혁신을 촉진하기 위해서는 이런 보수적인 법 체계를 어떻게 바꿔야 하나요?
Well, I don't really know if I need to answer your question, but I think I agree with the tone of the question. I would look. I think the regulatory context that you're operating in is always a very important variable. It's often not something you can change as a founder of a company. So you have to be aware of how heavily things are regulated. You know, in the U.S. In the U.S., software generally is not heavily regulated. You can start a new software company with maybe $100,000. Biotech, life sciences, very heavily regulated. And to get a new medicine, a new drug to market will cost maybe $1 billion. And so we have a lot more software companies and a lot fewer biotech companies. I personally think it should be less regulated, but setting aside what I believe should happen, I think the reality is always that it will change the ecosystem. It takes $1 billion to build a company. You'll build, we get few new drugs. We get lots of video game companies instead because they cost a lot less to start. So the regulatory context is incredibly important. I don't know if it's always possible as a small startup to change the entire regulatory environment. And so you have to always be very realistic about what it is, about what can be done. It's often, sometimes it can be very promising if you're in a sector which is fairly heavily regulated, but there's a trend towards less regulation. And so if there's actually a trend towards less regulation, you can start some new companies. So in the last decade in the US, the space industry was partially deregulated, and that created an opening for my friend Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, to build a private rocket company. And so, so it was important to be aware of this changing regulatory context. So I think given the very heavy amount of regulation in South Korea, if it gets deregulated, there probably would be an opening for many businesses. But if not, there probably wouldn't be. And so as a founder in this space, you have to be very realistic about the regulations and about the likely direction in which they're going to change in the years and decade ahead.
지금의 테크 부분을 2000년대의 닷컴 버블하고 이렇게 비교하는 분들도 요새 많이 있습니다. 그리고 자동차 한 대 가지고 있지 않은 우버의 시가총액이 현대 자동차보다도 높은 거에 대해서 말이 안 된다고 하시는 분들도 많아요. 그래서 어떻게 생각하십니까? 지금 옛날의 버블도 지금 겪어본 입장에서 지금의 이 테크 붐이 버블이라고 생각하십니까? 그때와 비교해서 뭐가 다르다고 생각하십니까?
Well, it's always hard to say. This is certainly a question that gets asked a lot in the U.S. as well. And of course, we had a crazy internet bubble in the 90s. We had a crazy housing and finance and credit bubble in the last decade. And so the US actually had two very insane bubbles in the last 2 decades. And so it's a very natural question whether there's a third bubble that's getting started now in some place or another. I do not believe there's a bubble in technology. I think the bubbles were psychosocial phenomena. They happened when the public at large got involved. In 1999, you had 300 IPOs in Silicon Valley in the US, and tech companies in the US. So the public was involved in a crazy way as companies went public, literally. in 2014, there were something like 47 tech IPOs. They happened much, much later. And so the public has been much less involved. It's been much less interested in this trend. And so I don't think you have a runaway bubble. It's of course very hard. You can always point to valuations of companies, but it's always very hard to know what the valuations of these companies were. You know, people were already talking about a tech bubble in 2007. I was on record at the time as saying there was no tech bubble. There was a video made of it, and it started with a clip of me saying there's no bubble in technology, and the whole video made fun of me for saying that. And one of the slides had Facebook versus Ford Motor Company, and Facebook and Ford were both valued at $15 billion at the time, and it was, how ridiculous is it that Facebook is as valuable as Ford Motor Company? And of course, it subsequently turned out that today it would be worth something like 4 or 5 times as much. So I think certainly a lot of value has been created on paper. The question of whether valuations are too high or not, you can't always just go with your intuitions on that. One difference, though, from you have all these private companies with very high valuations. It's very different from the 90s, but it's because the IPOs are happening much later. They're not going public till a much later date, and I think that's really what it's symptomatic of. Yahoo, Amazon, they went public at a market cap of $500 million or less in '96 and '97. Today, companies in Silicon Valley often don't go public till they have market capitalizations well north of 10 billion. And so in that sort of world, it's to be expected that you have far more companies that are worth $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion, even 10 billion that are going to be privately held when the IPOs are happening much, much later.
당신은 디벨롭된 나라가 디벨로핑을 어떻게 하는 거에 대한 중요하다는 그런 물음을 제로투원에서 던졌습니다. 근데 한국은 이제 거의 디벨롭 컨트리, 그러니까 거의 선진국의 문턱에 진입을 했고, 그리고 예전에 일본이 그렇듯이 빠르게 서구를 따라가서 오늘에 이르렀습니다. 그런데 지금은 혁신으로 계속 앞서가는 미국이 앞에 있고요. 그리고 거대한 내수 시장을 배경으로 무섭게 성장하는 중국 사이에서 좀 샌드위치가 된 느낌입니다. 한국은. 마치 이것은 애플하고 샤오미 사이에서 경쟁을 해야 되는 삼성전자의 그런 모습 같은데요. 한국은 앞으로 어떻게 나아가야 된다고 생각을 하십니까?
Well, you could start by reading my book, but no. I think that I do think that the challenge for a place like Korea, which I think people are very aware of, so I don't think I'm telling you anything that you do not already know, but once you are at the frontier, once you are a developed country like the US or Japan, progress at this point in Korea will come from doing new things. There are maybe still some things that can be copied from the US. It's actually not that much, and so it's a very different development model going forward, and it's in some ways much more challenging because when you're not at the frontier, there is a straightforward formula. The formula is you copy things that worked, you don't copy things that didn't work, so you can actually skip some steps, and this is the formula in the entire developing world. In the developed world, the formula, the anti-formula is you have to do new things, and this is quite a big challenge in all these countries. But I think welcome to the club. You're in the same boat as the U.S.
시간이 많이 지나서요. 대단히 죄송한데 저희가 질문을 받은 것을 하나만 청중 여러분 해주신 것을 하나만 받도록 하겠습니다. 하나 띄워주시겠어요? 너무 좀 긴데. 네, 제가 읽겠습니다. 한국에서의 스타트업이 가진 한계가 있을까요? 작은 시장에서 독점하여 크게 만드는 것이 효과적일 수 있겠지만 환경도 중요한 역할을 합니다. 한국에서 제로투원을 실현한 회사를 찾아보기 어려운 것이 우연은 아니라고 생각합니다. 만약에 한국에서 스타트업을 할 기회와 미국 실리콘밸리에서 스타트업을 할 수 있는 기회를 비교한다면 무엇이 다를까요? 한국 같은 보수적 투자 환경, 뚜렷한 비즈니스 모델이 있어야 투자를 해준다든지 실패자를 용납하지 않는 문화를 가진 이런 어려운 투자 환경에서 성공적으로 제로 투 원을 만들기 위해서 무엇이 특히 중요할까요?
Well, you know, there's always a temptation. There's this expression in English, the grass is always greener on the other side of the hill. And so there's always a temptation to think that it would be so much easier if you were transported to California or Silicon Valley. And you know, I think there are definitely some advantages Silicon Valley has. You have sort of a lot of people working on it. There's some experience and there's an ecosystem. But there are all these ways it can also be counterproductive. You know, if you start a startup in Silicon Valley, it's extremely expensive to hire people. It's very, very competitive. You know, the office space, all the infrastructure is actually at this point very, very stretched. The network effects that you have in Silicon Valley can all go in reverse, and because everybody's always talking to everybody else, you can get these dynamics similar to the ones I described in business school, where you end up with crowd-like, lemming-like behavior, and it's very hard for people to think on their own. So I think, so I certainly do think that you could build, you know, very successful companies in Korea, just as you could in Silicon Valley. There definitely are all these things one wants to think through very, very carefully. I think I think failure is always a big problem, and it's, you know, even in a place like California, when you fail, it's damaging to the people involved. They're psychologically damaged by failure. It often is hard to recover from failure, and so it's not just the society. It's always often much more of an internal thing where it's quite hard, and you have to somehow be resilient and keep going. You know, I always think people blame the venture capitalists a little bit too much. You know, I'm on the investor side, and there's always this tendency to say there aren't enough investors, and if we had more capital, the problems would be solved. I often think if you just had more startups, the capital would follow very naturally. So I would not blame the capital. There are all these cultural things that, you know, that are very complicated to know how to change, that are probably very important. But I think I think a big part of what's worked in Silicon Valley is that when you have a history of success, that sets an example for other people. And so in Silicon Valley, you now have had decades of success, and they're role models. You know, people don't follow them precisely, but there sort of is a sense that people can build great companies. And I think Korea has had a number of successful tech companies over the last decade or so. So it's not as though nothing has worked and there are no role models at all. So I think there is a pattern that's worked. And I think this is what inspires so many more people to try it. So I think it's, you know, even though there are challenges, I don't think they're insurmountable.
강력한 요구에 의해서 하나만 더 하겠습니다. 네, 스탠포드에는 특히 중퇴 이후 창업하여 성공한 사례가 많은 것으로 알고 있습니다. 한국에서도 청년들이 취업이 어려운 상황에서 심지어 취업하기 위해서 창업한다는 우스갯소리도 있는데요. 비단 한국뿐만 아니라 전 세계적으로 대학 교육이 기업가 정신을 독려하는 데 한계가 있다고 보시는지요? 아니면 우리가 대학 교육이라는 콘텐츠를 지혜롭게 이용할 수 있는 팁이 있을까요?
Again, very broad, very sweeping question. I think that I do think there's something about the tracking in our educational system that I think has gotten too extreme. You know, I can't speak about the system that much in Korea, but I think it's you know, it's in many ways, you know, maybe it's more extreme than even the U.S. But I think even the U.S. it's gotten very, very tracked, very focused on these things, and there is something very odd about a society where the only year of your life that matters is your 18th year. And that's when you take tests or you get into colleges, and that's when your whole life gets determined by what you do at age 18. And life does not end at age 18. It goes on much longer than that. One of my friends who got into Yale University, one of the sort of elite universities in the U.S., the dean welcomed the 18-year-old freshman and said, "Congratulations, you're in Yale. You're set for life." So we always focus on the people who lose the competitions of getting into these top universities, but I think they're often bad even for the winners. Like what sort of an attitude is that? We should be expecting more of our most talented people, and if we tell our most talented people that they're set for life when they've gotten into the right university, they are likely to do so much less than they otherwise would have. One of the other expressions is, the Rhodes Scholarship is a super prestigious scholarship in the U.S. Where you study in Britain for something like 32 people get it a year, and there's this expression that all Rhodes scholars had a great future in their past. And so because the day they got the Rhodes Scholar, people said they would have a tremendous future ahead of them. And Bill Clinton actually did become president after getting a Rhodes Scholarship, but he was the exception. So many of them did so little with these scholarships afterwards, and it was like an invitation to coast. It was an invitation to not work as hard anymore because you were told that you had won this thing and you were set. And so I think we need to think of education as not a preparation for college, but a preparation for life. And we need to think of our life as not consisting of our 18th year, but as consisting of, hopefully 100 or more years that we should be thinking of very hard how to make the most of.
감사합니다. 마지막 질문. 한국 스타트업이 당신한테 투자받으려면 어떻게 해야 됩니까?
Well, that is an extremely dangerous question to answer, especially in this room. I would say the general answer I always give is that you can't take a pitch in 10 seconds or 15 seconds. You can't listen to what people are doing. It takes at least an hour to have some reasonable sense to be able to give some sort of feedback. And then of course, I don't have the bandwidth or the ability to meet with so many people. But I would say the first step is to find somebody I trust, have them make an introduction, and then I will meet with you. Oh, I can't give you a list of people. I don't want you to be attacking all those people, so you have to figure that out.
Okay, thank you for taking your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
네, 박수 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.